Now that we've established this framework of how to program ESD, what we want to do is now think about how to actually implement this. How do we as strength and conditioning coaches implement these sessions with our athletes? Because everybody knows that it's easy to get athletes to work at high intensity for your ESD training sessions. And the way that we've traditionally measured intensity for ESD training sessions is heart rate. Heart rate has been the gold standard since the 80s when heart rate monitors started to become more available. And heart rate is, of course, responding to the work that's being done by the muscle, right, in order to accomplish the task. Muscle, of course, will contract to create movement. When it contracts, it creates these byproducts, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and lactate, right, among others. We talked about these in the previous presentation. And that as these byproducts accumulate, the body requires more oxygen to buffer these byproducts so that they don't begin to accumulate, because when they do accumulate, this is when fatigue is induced, right, and we're not able to perform. The reason that heart rate increases relative to the work that you're doing is because of the byproduct that's produced specific to that movement. So heart rate responds not as a direct measure of intensity, but as an indirect response to intensity, because there is that little bit of delay. This is why when you finish your high-intensity ESD interval, your heart rate, you can see, continues to elevate for 2 to 5 seconds before it starts to drop. Heart rate, of course, is also going to respond not only based on the physical environment in which you're working, but also the emotional and psychological environment that you're working in. Think about this soccer goalie. Okay, this goalie, when he's lining up to take this penalty kick, his heart rate isn't going to be very low, is it? Right? Even though he's not doing a lot of work, he's just standing in that same position, his heart rate's going to be quite elevated because of the emotional and psychological environment in which he's working. So heart rate is going to be a response to the total environment that we're working in. Under recovery from previous training sessions, not getting enough sleep, not having adequate fueling. All of these different emotional, physical, and psychological variables are going to influence and potentially inflate your heart rate response to exactly the same training stimulus, right? And therefore, it's not necessarily going to be the most accurate measure of intensity. So what is then? Right? Maybe we have something that's going to be a more direct measure of intensity, and power, I think, is just that. Now, when we think of measuring power, of course, the first thing that comes to mind if you've worked with endurance athletes is a power meter. The power meter, of course, is a specific tool that goes on a bike that allows us to measure power put out into the bike in watts. But that can be prohibitively expensive, right, and is specific only to that cycling event. What if there was another way to measure power through a wide variety of different training programs? And I think then if we look at time, we can use that as an indirect rather than a direct measure of power. So if I give you a task, okay, say it's going to be 1,000 feet on the VersaClimber and 100 kettlebell swings, okay, and I just say you can break it up however it is that you want to break it up, just get it done. And I measure the time it takes you to complete that task. The time it takes you to complete that task is therefore a representation of the power that you're working at. The power then is going to be a direct measure of the intensity at which you're working. And so even though I'm not measuring your body's physiological response to the work that you're doing, I understand, first of all, that that physiological response is going to be specific to those individual movements. But also, I understand that I'm still measuring intensity by looking at the amount of time it takes you to complete that. That then becomes a very powerful tool, which we're going to talk about here in a second, to use next week, right? When I can say, hey, remember last week when we did that 1,000 feet on the VersaClimber 100 kettlebell swings, that took you 9 minutes and 45 seconds, right? Today we're doing the same task, go. Again, we talked about how competition can be such an effective training variable, and we're going to speak about that a little bit as well. So power is a much more direct measure of intensity that you're working at, and it doesn't have to just be time to complete a task. I could give you a specific amount of time and see how much work you're able to do in that amount of time. An example may be a circuit, a metabolic type circuit, okay, where we have, so you're doing push-ups and you're doing 100-foot efforts on the VersaClimber and you're doing kettlebell swings and you're doing sled pulls and you're doing bear crawls. Okay, I could say you're going to do a specific amount of each of those and you're going to go for 15 minutes. Let's see how many times you can get around. The total number of rounds that you complete in that specific task could just as easily be my measure of power that I then give you as a target next week to work around, right, and to work within. So measuring power indirectly and giving that representation of intensity can be a much more direct sort of look at the intensity at which our athletes are working. It also allows for them the opportunity to self-select the pacing strategy that's going to result in the most efficient use of their time. So looking at power can be an incredibly powerful tool. And typically the type of sessions that we apply with regards to using power as that variable rather than intensity allows us to let the drill do the coaching for you. And this becomes an incredibly powerful piece, where if I give you, as the coach, a specific task, Okay, again, 1,000 feet on the vertical climber, 100 kettlebell swings. That then puts the responsibility of selecting the intensity that you're working at on you. And so that then is a decision that you make. First of all, it's a decision that you make on whether or not you accept that task. Confronting you then with an obstacle, with something that's going to impede your ability to perform, with something that's going to be difficult and uncomfortable. And the first thing that you decide is that, yes, I'm going to do this. Once you do make that decision, okay, you have the opportunity then to figure out on your own what the best intensity is going to be. I'm not standing there behind you as the DVD player in the system cheerleading you on the whole time. This makes my job as a coach much easier, at least in the way that we apply ESD intensity. We understand that this also makes my job a lot harder on the front end. Because if I give you a specific target, if I give you a specific goal, for example, that 1,000 feet on the vertical climber 100 kettlebell swings, I better know that that goal is just going to be out of reach of what you're going to be able to do. Because if it's too easy, then there's not going to be enough stimulus. And if it's too hard, then you're just setting the athlete up for failure, and they're never going to be able to do this again, right? There's this downward sort of spiral. But if I, as a coach, know what it is that you're going to be able to do, I can then use that information to apply the intensity that I want based on the amount of time that I estimate it's going to take you to finish that task, so that I then put the responsibility back in your hands of selecting the work that you do, right? And that then increases your ability to perform on the field without the assistance, without that DVD running in the back of your head, without the coach telling you what positions you need to be in, how hard you need to be working, whether you need to be pushing or pulling, etc. This then creates a much more intimate relationship of the athlete to the programming, right? Where that athlete then is able to use this on their own. We are like the bumpers on the bowling lane. It's not our job to knock down the pins. It's just our job to make sure the ball's headed in the right direction. And if we set our ESD training sessions up in such a way that we allow our athletes to self-select their pacing by applying this power-based intensity measure rather than a heart rate-based measure, this allows the athlete the opportunity to develop that relationship with the training program. There's two really specific ways that we can talk about doing this. The first is by inducing competition. If I have a number of athletes who start at the same line, that are doing the same drill, and start at the same time, I don't care who you are, that's a race. And if you're working with an athletic population, of course, athletes we know want to finish first. If you're working with a bunch of general population folks, then we know that they don't want to be last. So there's a social impetus to perform at high intensity to accomplish these tasks. This then allows the group to select the intensity that everybody is working with, and becomes an incredibly powerful tool, again, because that is not a decision that I make as your strength and conditioning coach. That is not a responsibility that I have. If you've got a group of athletes, of course, it's very easy to line everybody up and do the same thing at the same time. But you can use that measure of time, total number of reps completed, time to complete a task, etc., whatever it is, as a competitive measure with individual athletes as well. On the first day that you do your ESD training session, you get a baseline. And then next week when you come back to that, hey, last time that took you 13 and a half minutes. And that's all you have to say. With athletes, of course, they want to win. But with general population folks, that almost becomes an even more powerful variable. Because if I tell you what you did last time, the general population folks who are coming to train with you are coming to train with you specifically because they want to be better than the person that they were yesterday. And so if you tell them who they were yesterday by showing them the variable that they worked at last week, that then gives them a very tangible sort of data point to work towards. And I guarantee you that the intensity that your athletes and that your general population folks are going to be working at is going to be much higher in an effort to accomplish that. The other way that we can use power here is by looking at setting goals. So we have a specific amount of time. I want you to complete X number of reps. We have a specific distance. I want you to finish it in Y time. Okay? We can use these different sorts of things to set up different mental constructs about ways to accomplish the task. Now, when we look at applying intensity across the training sessions, we know that higher intensity sessions generally are going to be shorter, moderate intensity are going to be somewhat longer, and that the lower intensity are going to be longer still. And so by estimating or having a very good idea generally of the time that it's going to take my athletes to complete a task, I, as a strength and conditioning coach, then can select which drills fit better into each profile so that my athlete then still has the opportunity to race or compete with themselves and the others to accomplish that task. But because I have given them the amount of work that they're going to be doing relative to a specific amount of time, I know that even though they're sprinting to complete that task, the time it's going to take is going to necessitate a decreased intensity to complete that task. Okay, so when I look at applying a high intensity session, I might choose a shorter number of events. Okay, you're going 5 seconds on the VersaClimber, and in those 5 seconds, I want you to get 30 feet. I want you to get your maximal speed on the curve. I want you to do a 100-yard shuttle on a 50-yard course. All of these are going to be a very short time, therefore allowing for a very high intensity. Taking a metabolic style circuit is going to be a great way to get that medium sort of zone, that moderate intensity for moderate duration. There's all different sorts of structures to these metabolic conditioning circuits, but they become incredibly powerful tools to be able to match the split that you're working on with your strength program, all the while introducing strength endurance within the context of that moderate intensity ESD training session. And then for that lower intensity stuff that we do on our regen days, our active recovery, our 20-minute flush, whatever it is, I can now start to give you goals on the elliptical, on the bike, or whatever piece of equipment it is that you're using, so that you then are able to moderate intensity to accomplish that recovery flush. You're not just going to be sitting there and texting on your phone while you're working, but you're actually going to be focused on working. For example, if I know that you're quite fit and I put you on the elliptical, I might set the level on the elliptical such that it's going to be a moderate resistance, but I might give you a goal. In these 20 minutes, I want you to do 3 miles. And again, as a coach, that's all I have to say. I create the environment, I let my athlete work in that environment, and then I get out of the way and let them do the work. So using power to measure intensity can be an incredibly beneficial tool when looking not only at the direct application of intensity, but also allowing your athletes the opportunity to learn and do on their own. So in this check for learning, what I want you to do is design 3 ESD drills. I want you to design one that's going to target high intensity with low volume, one that's going to target moderate intensity with moderate volume, and then one that's going to target low intensity with high volume. What I want to do now is look at a case study. Give ourselves the opportunity to work through these steps and see how we're able to put together an ESD training program based on a specific case. So in this case study, we're going to look at a rugby player. We're going to assume that the rugby player has no injuries and that he's in his off season, meaning he's not working with his team, right? And also, in the scope of this presentation, we're going to think about creating ESD training programs on their own, remember. So the first thing we need to do is to identify metabolic weak links. And so if we look at where this rugby player is going to fall in this speed power profile, okay, we look at the fundamental variables of the game. We know that rugby lasts 80 minutes. We know that it's very unlikely for him to return after a substitution with small sort of situations here. And that on average, he's going to cover between 7 and 9 kilometers over the course of those 80 minutes. Okay, so we would say that he probably fits right in that middle zone, just like that soccer player that we talked about before. Okay, so just like that soccer player before, he's going to have a large ability there in that central zone, buffeted by a moderate ability there over on the right zone because of the time that it's taking to complete the games and the time that it's taking to complete practice sessions. And that he's going to have maybe more of an opportunity compared to a soccer player with regard to exposure to those very short duration, very high intensity efforts. But comparatively to the other 2 zones here, if we were to rank them first, second, third, it would likely go in this order. In his practice, he's working in these sorts of areas. So now in training, we want to work in the opposite areas, right? So we're focusing more on that area to the left with very short, very high intensity, focusing secondarily on that area to the right with that low intensity for long duration. And we want to focus last, okay, on that moderate zone because that's the opposite of the way he's performing when he's in his practice session. So now, because we're only considering ESD training intensity, we can start to look at the way that we're going to apply across the training week. And of course, we're going to take that general sort of application of intensity, allowing ourselves the opportunity to build into intensity through the early parts of the week, come down for that active recovery regeneration session in the middle part of the week, and then do that whole cycle again through the back part of the week, giving us 4 days of training, 2 days of active recovery, and then 1 day of complete rest. So now we can start to target specific metabolic qualities that we know that our athletes are going to be missing based on the information that we got out of that first step of identifying their weak links. So we look at the speed power profile here, right? And of course, understand there's going to be a high, medium, and low intensity type zone. And we need to start working in a way that's going to target the adaptations necessary. Remember, we talked about how in terms of prioritization, we're going to prioritize number 1, that left zone, that very high intensity work. Number 2 in that priority list is going to be that right zone, that lower intensity, longer duration. And then finally, in the bottom of that prioritization, we're going to work on the same areas or the same qualities that they do in practice, just to keep them kind of working there. So on day 1, day 1 is going to be a medium intensity day, and here I'm going to allow the athlete the opportunity to work in similar intensities that they will when they're in their practice sessions by giving them a metabolic circuit. Okay, so here we're going to be 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and it's going to be a circuit of walking lunges. These could be weighted based on the fitness of the athlete. Bear crawls, you could just as easily add weight on a sled behind them that they have to pull around. a sled row, which of course you can modify the intensity by increasing or decreasing the weight, and then rope slams, right, which you can change the intensity on by changing the exercise that you're doing. We do each exercise for 30 seconds. We give our athletes a 30-second rest period, a transition time. You could just as easily throw in an active recovery session here, working on some pillar strength with some pillar bridging, some opposite arm and leg lifts, whatever it may be. This then, though, allows the athlete the opportunity through the course of those 30-second bouts to be able to work at the intensity necessary to accomplish each individual session, right? And because we've designed it in this way, we know that we go from a lower body to more of a pillar-based, to more of an upper body, to finally finishing off with that strong upper body work with the rope slam, okay? And in this instance, we're going to repeat for 10 to 15 minutes. So we've got a moderate amount of work that we're doing, okay? And the athlete's then going to have the opportunity to moderate intensity accordingly. Day 2 then is going to be our high intensity day. And with my rugby player, with my team sport athletes, I really love to put them all the way as far to the left side of that curve as possible. Okay, because that's not a place that they really see a whole lot of work in their practice. And so on day 2, what I've got him doing is 100-yard shuttles on a 50-yard course. Okay, so he's going to go 50 yards down and back, and you're going to start every minute, meaning that the faster you complete each rep, the more rest you get. Okay? Athletes typically have some experience working in these types of sessions. But why I like that ratio is because that gives us about a 5 or a 6 to 1 rest to work ratio. And that rest to work ratio is really what's necessary in order to accomplish these tasks. Because I want you to work as high an intensity as possible throughout the course of this session. Right? And if I give you that amount of rest, there's still going to be some byproduct that's accumulating, right? And you'd be surprised that at the end, you're still going to be quite fatigued, heart rate's going to be quite elevated, you're going to be quite tired, but this still allows you a large amount of time to recover in between sessions so that you're able to work at very high intensity. This is sort of the ESD equivalent of max strength training. Very small volume, very high amount of rest in order to accommodate the intensity that you're working at. Regen day then, I'm going to give my athlete a short task here. Okay, he's going to be on the elliptical. I understand that he's quite fit, so he's going to do 3 miles in less than 20 minutes on that elliptical for that active recovery, carrying on then afterwards into some soft tissue, mobility work, and maybe some activation exercises, and finishing with a hydrotherapy session. On into day 3. Day 3, remember, is a medium intensity day, again, building into intensity here, right? But we know that we don't want to have a whole lot of exposure to that central zone, and so we put our athlete there over on the right zone by giving him a biking task. So he's going to be doing a hill climb. Say he starts at gear 6 on the Kaiser bikes. He'll add 2 gears every 2 minutes for 10 minutes. So he'll go 2 minutes at gear 6, 2 minutes at 8, 2 minutes at 10, 2 minutes at 12, and 2 minutes at 14. Okay, understanding that you're going to program the level that you start at based on the level that you're going to finish at and how difficult it's going to be to maintain that zone. After he finishes that 2 minutes at 14, we come back down and do that all over again. Understanding, of course, that you're going to be able to moderate this based on the fitness of the athlete, and you're going to be able to accomplish that by changing the starting level to therefore change also the finishing level. Finally, on day 4, okay, we want that ESD session to be very high intensity again because they're carrying on into the weekend, because they're carrying on directly into that regeneration session, and so we know that we're able to send them home a little bit tired, a little bit hungry, so we can make their parents a little bit happy, right? That day 4 session is going to be another high intensity one, and because there's so much fatigue that may have accumulated throughout the system through the course of the week, I want to slightly moderate the intensity that you're working at by increasing the amount of time that it's going to take you to complete these tasks. Okay? So here I'm going to put you on the Versa Climber to take you out of that outdoor environment. I'm going to take away the change of direction task that you're going to have to do on that 100-yard shuttle. Okay? And so I'm going to be therefore mitigating and controlling exposure to these extraneous variables that might increase intensity. Okay? And we're going to do 10-second on, 50-second off Versa Climber sprints. We're just going to do one set of 10. Okay, but within these 10-second sprints, I'm going to give you the goal that I want you to get 50 feet accomplished. If you've ever been on a Versa Climber, you know that that's a lot of work to be done. Some athletes, this is going to be incredibly difficult to do even 1. Some athletes are going to struggle to do 6, 7, 8. Some athletes are going to have an easy time doing 10. And so, of course, this goal is something that you're going to be able to moderate and change on a case-by-case basis. I love this 10-second 50-foot goal, though, because it really puts that picture in their head of how hard they need to be working. You can see them do the math, and you can see when they figure out how hard it is that they've got to push and how that translates into the work that they do. Just by giving that goal, I'm able to give my athlete the opportunity to choose to work at that intensity. So across the training week, Okay, we've developed this ESD training program with the explicit goal of targeting specific metabolic qualities that athlete is missing, that we know that athlete is missing based on the metabolic profiling that we did, based on their speed power profile, and that these have been applied across the training week in an intelligent and balanced way, okay, so that we then are able to maximize our ability to perform with these athletes. So in closing, when addressing programming needs of an athlete or client, we need to be targeted of specific factors of metabolic conditioning. We want to identify metabolic weak links as that first step, understanding the areas of conditioning that are largest potential setbacks. We can develop then those traits to support high performance across the spectrum. Next, we want to build balance across training weeks. So ensuring that programming is well-rounded, we can leave no stone unturned and prevent the occurrence of gaps in training and abilities. Finally, then, we target specific metabolic qualities by recognizing that varied intensities develop distinct energy pathways, and we can therefore optimize performance specific to the demands of athlete and sport. This three-step process is going to allow us the opportunity, or at least the framework, to be able to start to program our ESD training session. Now, when it comes to coaching, one key to appropriately developing energy systems is to have a clear understanding of the intensity at which your client or athlete is working. And so we look at the ways that we measure intensity. As a coach, we know that we have to take cues from certain aspects of the athlete's training. With regards to heart rate, we understand that it's going to be affected by these various environmental factors, physical and psychological as well as emotional. Power, though, is not. And so we look at where it's going to be appropriate to apply one versus the other. Finally, carefully designed drills are going to dictate the intensity demanded based on the perceived amount of time that it's going to take to complete that task, and therefore influence specific energy system use and development, augmenting the adaptation that we get because we are more precisely applying the stimulus that we're giving to our athlete. Finally, with regards to application to sport, we have to understand how sport influences the training demands of the athlete's energy needs. We have to apply critical thinking to assess an athlete's metabolic needs for his or her specific sport. And we need to appropriately prescribe training to develop those characteristics while mitigating simultaneously the risk of injury and overtraining.